The wind howled through the mountain pines like a wounded animal, carrying snow that cut like glass across the frozen wilderness. In a small cabin, barely visible through the storm, 17-year-old Samuel Mitchell sat by his dying fire, counting his last 3 potatoes and wondering if he'd see spring. He'd been alone up here for 2 winters now, ever since his grandfather passed, surviving on dried meat and stubborn hope. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles down a treacherous mountain trail he hadn't traveled in months. Then came the knock, weak, desperate, barely audible over the wind. Samuel froze, his heart hammering. Nobody came up here, nobody even knew he existed. Another knock, softer this time, followed by a woman's voice, trembling with cold and something deeper than fear. What Samuel would discover on the other side of that door would test everything he thought he knew about survival, trust, and the true meaning of family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel's calloused fingers traced the familiar grooves in his grandfather's leather journal. The pages yellowed from wood smoke and countless readings. Each morning for the past 2 years, he'd opened to the same entry, October 15th. Winter preparations complete. Enough firewood for 4 months, dried venison hanging in the smokehouse, root vegetables stored in the cellar. The boy learns quickly. The boy. That's what grandfather had called him right up until the end, even when Samuel had grown tall enough to reach the top shelf without standing on the old wooden stool. Now, at 17, Samuel felt ancient in ways that had nothing to do with years. He closed the journal and surveyed his domain. The one-room cabin measured barely 20 feet square, but every inch served a purpose. Grandfather's hunting rifle hung above the stone fireplace, cleaned and oiled just as he'd been taught. Cast-iron pots dangled from hooks near the hearth, waiting for the meager meals Samuel rationed carefully. The wooden table bore knife marks from decades of meal preparation, and Samuel could still picture his grandfather's weathered hands working there, teaching him to clean fish and prepare game. The morning routine never varied. Check the fire, add wood if needed, inspect the food stores, review the weather through the single window that faced east toward the valley. Today, like most days, the view showed nothing but endless white. Snow had fallen steadily for 3 days, adding to the 4 feet already accumulated. The silence up here felt different from the quiet of civilization. It pressed against the cabin walls like a living thing, broken only by the occasional crack of a tree branch surrendering to ice. Samuel pulled on his grandfather's oversized coat and stepped into the bitter air. The cold hit his lungs like a physical blow, but he'd learned to breathe shallow until his body adjusted. The path to the woodshed had disappeared under fresh snow, but his feet knew the way. 18 steps straight, turn left at the large boulder, 12 more steps to the door. Inside the shed, his breath formed small clouds as he selected pieces of seasoned oak. Grandfather had taught him to choose wood like a chess player, thinking 3 moves ahead. Dense hardwood for overnight burns, kindling for quick heat, green wood only in emergencies when you need smoke. The old man's voice echoed so clearly that Samuel sometimes turned, expecting to see him standing there with that patient smile. Back inside, Samuel counted his provisions with the methodical precision of someone who understood that miscounting meant death. 3 potatoes, wrinkled but solid. 2 pounds of dried venison, enough for perhaps 10 days if he stretched it. A small bag of cornmeal, maybe a week's worth of thin porridge. Some wild onions he'd found before the heavy snows came. No salt left, no sugar, no coffee. The nearest town lay 30 miles down treacherous mountain roads that became impassable once winter set its teeth into the landscape. He'd made the journey twice since grandfather died, both times in early fall when the weather still cooperated. The townspeople treated him with a mixture of pity and bewilderment. "Come down and stay with us, son," old Mrs. Henderson had offered. No boy should live up there alone. But Samuel always declined. The mountain was home. It was all he'd ever known, and somehow it felt like abandoning grandfather to leave. The journal contained 2 years of survival wisdom, but also glimpses into family history Samuel treasured. Grandfather had come to these mountains as a young man himself, fleeing some unspecified trouble down in the valley. He'd built this cabin with his own hands, lived through winters that would have killed lesser men, and raised Samuel's father here until the boy grew restless and moved to town. Samuel had never known his parents well. They'd died in a car accident when he was 5, and Grandfather had stepped in without question or complaint. "The mountains teach you what matters," Grandfather used to say while they sat by the fire on long winter nights. "Food, shelter, warmth, everything else is just noise." Samuel had thought he understood then, but 2 years of solitude had driven the lesson deep into his bones. As afternoon faded toward evening, Samuel prepared his daily meal: a thin soup made from 1 potato, a small portion of venison, and water flavored with wild onions. It barely filled his bowl, but it would sustain him for another day. He ate slowly, making each spoonful last, while the wind outside began its nightly symphony. The loneliness had weight to it, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He talked to himself sometimes, or to Grandfather's memory, just to hear a human voice. The silence could drive a person mad if they let it. Samuel had seen what isolation did to old Jake Brennan, who'd lived 5 miles up the ridge until they found him one spring, sitting in his chair like he'd just decided to stop. Tonight felt different somehow. The wind carried a restless energy that made Samuel's skin prickle with unease. He checked the door latch twice, though no human had visited this cabin in over a year. Something was coming. He could feel it in the way the storm hesitated between gusts, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. The door creaked open against the wind's resistance, and Samuel's breath caught in his throat. A woman collapsed against the doorframe, her dark hair matted with ice, her coat torn and inadequate for the brutal cold. She looked up at him with eyes that held more exhaustion than he'd ever seen in a living person. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Just one night." Samuel stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with delicate features that spoke of a gentler life than his mountain existence. But it was her condition that sent alarm through his system. She was heavily pregnant, her belly prominent even beneath the insufficient layers of clothing. "I won't make it," she continued, her lips blue with cold. "The baby, please." Training from his grandfather kicked in. Get her warm, food and shelter first, questions later. Samuel stepped aside and helped her through the doorway, her weight surprising him with how little there was of it. She felt like a bird in his arms, all bones and desperation. He guided her to the chair closest to the fire and immediately began building up the flames. She shivered so violently that the chair shook beneath her. Samuel grabbed his grandfather's heaviest blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders, then knelt to examine her feet. Her shoes were canvas sneakers, completely inadequate for mountain weather. When he pulled them off, her toes were white with frostbite. "What's your name?" he asked, rubbing her feet gently to restore circulation. "Elena," she managed through chattering teeth. "Elena Rodriguez. I'm Samuel. You're safe now." She looked around the cabin with wide eyes, taking in the sparse furnishings, the hunting rifle, the evidence of solitary survival. "You live here alone?" "2 years now, since my grandfather passed." Samuel stood and ladled warm broth from the pot that always simmered by the fire. "Drink this slowly." Elena accepted the cup with shaking hands and sipped carefully. Color began returning to her cheeks, but Samuel could see the wariness in her eyes. She studied him as if trying to determine whether he represented salvation or a different kind of danger. "How far along?" Samuel asked, nodding toward her belly. 8 months, maybe more. I lost track." Her voice carried shame that made Samuel's chest ache. "I've been walking for 3 days." 3 days? In this weather? Samuel couldn't hide his shock. "Where did you come from?" Elena's face closed off, and she pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "It doesn't matter. I just need to get through the night, then I'll move on." "Move on where?" "The nearest town is 30 miles, and these roads are impassable until spring." Samuel knelt beside her chair. "Mom, with respect, you're not going anywhere for months." Terror flashed across Elena's features. "No, I can't stay. He'll find me. I have to keep moving." "Who will find you?" Elena turned her face away, but not before Samuel saw tears forming. When she shifted position, something fell from her coat pocket. A photograph, torn in half. Samuel picked it up and saw Elena's face, younger and smiling, standing next to a man whose face had been deliberately torn away. Only his hand remained visible on Elena's shoulder, gripping tight enough that Samuel could see the pressure marks on her skin, even in the faded image. Elena snatched the photograph back, but the damage was done. Samuel had seen enough to understand. "He hurt you," Samuel said quietly. Elena's composure crumbled. She pressed her hands to her face and sobbed with the intensity of someone who'd been holding back tears for too long. Samuel felt helpless watching her pain, this stranger who'd appeared like a ghost at his door. "I was stupid," she whispered. "I thought I could make it to my sister's place in Colorado. I had some money saved, but the bus broke down in town and I spent everything on a room for 2 nights. When the storm started, I panicked. I knew he'd check the hotels first." "What's his name?" "Marcus." She spoke it like a curse. "Marcus Rodriguez, my husband." The word came out bitter and full of hate. "He said he'd kill me if I ever tried to leave. Kill me and the baby both." Samuel felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach. He'd never encountered violence like this, but he recognized evil when he saw it. The torn photograph spoke volumes about a man who would destroy even memories of happiness. "You're safe here," Samuel said with conviction he didn't entirely feel. "Nobody knows about this place except me." Elena looked at him with desperate hope. "You don't understand. He has connections, resources. If he wants to find me badly enough, he'd have to know these mountains. He'd have to survive weather that kills experienced hunters." Samuel stood and checked the door latch again. "And he'd have to get past me." Elena almost smiled at that, this thin mountain boy promising to protect her from a man she clearly feared more than death. But something in Samuel's eyes, something old and steady despite his youth, seemed to reassure her. Samuel pulled his grandfather's thickest wool blanket from the cedar chest, the one that had kept the old man warm through 40 winters on this mountain. The fabric still held the faint scent of pipe tobacco and wood smoke, comforting smells that reminded Samuel of safety and protection. He wrapped it carefully around Elena's shoulders, layering it over the first blanket. "This was my grandfather's," he said softly. "It's never failed to keep someone warm." Elena's fingers traced the blanket's worn edges, feeling the care woven into every thread. "You don't have to give me your best things. I don't want to take what little you have. We share what we have up here. That's how people survive." Samuel moved to the stove and began preparing the only meal he could offer. "My grandfather used to say that hoarding in hard times just makes the hard times longer." The simple wisdom struck Elena with unexpected force. She'd spent 3 years walking on eggshells, measuring every word, rationing even her thoughts around Marcus. The idea of generous sharing felt foreign and precious. Samuel worked quietly, stretching his meager supplies to feed 2 people. He added extra water to the soup, cut his remaining potato into smaller pieces, and used the last of his dried herbs to mask the thinness of the broth. Elena watched his careful movements, noting how he automatically gave her the larger portion without making a show of the sacrifice. "When are you due?" Samuel asked as they ate by the firelight. "Christmas, maybe a little after. I'm not exactly sure." Elena's hand moved protectively to her belly. "I missed some appointments when things got difficult." Samuel nodded, not pressing for details she wasn't ready to share. Instead, he found himself studying her face in the warm glow of the flames. Beneath the exhaustion and fear, he could see strength. She'd walked 3 days through a blizzard while 8 months pregnant. That took a kind of courage he wasn't sure he possessed. "Boy or girl?" he asked. For the first time since arriving, Elena's face softened into something approaching a smile. "I don't know. I wanted it to be a surprise." She paused, her expression growing complicated. Marcus wanted to know. He had plans depending on which it was. The way she said plans made Samuel's skin crawl, but he kept his voice steady. "What do you want?" "Healthy, safe, loved." Elena's voice broke slightly on the last word. "I want this baby to know what it feels like to be loved." They finished eating in comfortable silence, the wind providing a steady soundtrack outside. Samuel cleared the dishes and began arranging sleeping space. The cabin had only one bed, barely large enough for his lanky frame. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll make a pallet by the fire." "I can't take your bed. You're pregnant and half-frozen. You need proper rest." Samuel was already pulling quilts from the chest. "Besides, I'm used to sleeping light. Mountain habit." Elena lowered herself carefully onto the bed, her pregnancy making even simple movements awkward. Samuel noticed her wince and realized she was hiding pain from more than just the cold and exhaustion. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Elena hesitated, then pulled back her sleeve to reveal finger-shaped bruises on her wrist, dark purple against her pale skin. "He grabbed me when I tried to leave the first time. This was from 2 weeks ago." Samuel felt rage build in his chest, hot and unfamiliar. He'd never wanted to hurt another person before, but the sight of those bruises awakened something protective and fierce. "He won't touch you again," Samuel said with quiet conviction. "You don't know Marcus. He's not like other men. He's dangerous. So are these mountains. So is winter. Sometimes dangerous things cancel each other out." Elena pulled the grandfather's blanket up to her chin, feeling truly warm for the first time in days. The cabin suddenly felt less like a shelter and more like a home. Samuel moved around the small space with practiced efficiency, banking the fire for the night, checking the door and windows, settling into routines that spoke of deep familiarity with this place. "Samuel," Elena's voice was soft in the darkness. "Thank you. I know this complicates your life." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, lying on his makeshift bed near the dying fire. "My grandfather used to say that complications are just life, asking you to grow up faster than you planned." He turned toward her voice. "Maybe I was due for some complications." Elena felt tears on her cheeks, but for the first time in months, they weren't from fear or despair. This strange, serious boy had opened his door, and his home, without question, had wrapped her in his grandfather's blanket like she was family, had shared his food without counting the cost. She'd forgotten that such kindness existed in the world. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, but inside the small cabin, two people who'd been alone too long began the careful process of trusting each other. The fire settled into glowing coals, casting gentle shadows on the walls, and for the first time since leaving her old life, Elena felt something she'd almost forgotten how to recognize: safety. Samuel woke to a sound he'd learned to fear, the absolute silence that came when wind stopped howling. He sat up from his pallet by the fire, instantly alert. In the mountains, sudden quiet often meant the storm was gathering strength for something worse. The radio crackled on the shelf where his grandfather had kept it for emergency weather updates. Samuel turned the dial carefully, searching for the morning forecast that helped him plan each day's survival. Static filled the small speaker, then a voice emerged through the interference. "Unprecedented snowfall totals. State of emergency declared. All roads impassable." The voice cut out abruptly. Samuel adjusted the antenna, tapped the side of the radio, tried different frequencies. Nothing. The old unit had finally surrendered after years of faithful service, leaving them completely cut off from weather information and emergency contact. Elena stirred on the bed, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. "What's wrong?" "Radio's dead." Samuel tried to keep worry out of his voice. "Can't get weather updates anymore." Through the single window, dawn revealed a landscape transformed overnight. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls, reaching nearly to the windowsill. The familiar landmarks Samuel used for navigation had vanished under pristine white. Even the large boulder that marked the path to his woodshed was barely visible as a small mound. Elena struggled to sit up, then gasped and doubled over, her face contorting in pain. "What is it?" Samuel was beside her in 2 strides. "Contraction," she panted. "Been having them since yesterday, but this one was stronger." Samuel's blood went cold. He knew almost nothing about childbirth, except that it required medical care, hospitals, trained professionals, things that were 30 miles away through impassable roads. "How far apart are they?" "Maybe an hour, sometimes longer." Elena breathed through the pain. "It's probably false labor. First babies usually come late." But Samuel heard the uncertainty in her voice. They both understood their situation with crystal clarity, trapped by the worst blizzard in years, no communication with the outside world, and Elena possibly going into premature labor. Another contraction hit 20 minutes later, stronger than the first. Elena gripped the blanket so hard her knuckles went white, biting her lip to keep from crying out. When it passed, she looked at Samuel with naked fear. "I can't have this baby here, not like this." Samuel's mind raced through impossible options. The nearest neighbor, old Pete Harrison, lived 15 miles down a treacherous mountain trail that would be suicidal to attempt in these conditions. The town with its small hospital might as well have been on the moon. Even if he could somehow make the journey, by the time he returned with help, Elena could be dead. "Maybe the contractions will stop," Samuel said, trying to convince himself as much as her. "Maybe it's just stress from the cold and the journey." But even as he spoke, he was calculating supplies in his head. Clean cloths, hot water, sharp knife for cutting the cord. His grandfather had delivered foals and calves in emergencies, but Samuel had never paid close attention to those lessons. They'd seemed irrelevant to his mountain existence. The wind returned with vengeance, shaking the cabin's sturdy walls. Snow began falling again, heavy flakes that meant the storm was far from over. Through the window, Samuel watched his world disappear under an endless white curtain. Elena had another contraction 40 minutes later, then another 30 minutes after that. The intervals were shortening, and her pain was intensifying. She tried to hide it, but Samuel could see her fear growing with each episode. "Samuel," she said during a brief respite, "if something happens to me, promise you'll try to save the baby. Nothing's going to happen to you. Promise me." Her grip on his hand was surprisingly strong. "This baby is innocent in all of this. Whatever mistakes I made, whatever brought me here, this child deserves a chance." Samuel looked into her eyes and saw a mother's fierce love already burning there. "I promise, but I'm going to save both of you." Elena squeezed his hand once more, then leaned back against the pillow. Outside, the storm raged with renewed fury, as if nature itself was determined to test their resolve. The broken radio sat silent on its shelf, a stark reminder that they were completely alone. Samuel fed more wood to the fire and began taking inventory of anything that might help with an emergency birth. Clean sheets, his sharpest knife, the bottle of whiskey his grandfather had saved for medicinal purposes. It wasn't much, but it might have to be enough. The mountains had always been unforgiving, but now they faced a test that would determine whether Samuel was truly his grandfather's worthy successor. Elena's contractions had stopped for nearly 2 hours, bringing cautious relief to the small cabin. She sat propped against the headboard, her hands resting on her belly, watching Samuel tend the fire with movements that reminded her of an old man despite his 17 years. There was something ancient in the way he cared for their small world, as if he'd been born understanding that survival required constant vigilance. "You never talk about yourself," Elena observed softly. "Only about your grandfather." Samuel paused in his wood stacking. "Not much to say. Been up here most of my life. But before that, you had parents. They died when I was 5. Car accident on the mountain road during a spring thaw." Samuel's voice held no self-pity, just the flat acceptance of someone who'd made peace with loss long ago. "Grandfather took me in without question, said the mountains needed someone young to learn their ways." Elena studied his profile in the firelight. "That's a lot of responsibility for a child." "Didn't feel like responsibility then. Felt like adventure." Samuel sat back on his heels. "Grandfather made everything seem like a grand expedition, checking trap lines, chopping wood, reading weather signs. He had a way of making survival feel like the most important game in the world." A comfortable silence settled between them. Elena's hand moved unconsciously to her coat pocket, checking for something that wasn't there. Samuel noticed the gesture. "What are you looking for?" Elena's face clouded. "Nothing, just habit." But her fingers continued their searching motion, and Samuel saw her growing agitation. "Elena." She looked up at him, and something in his steady gaze broke through her defenses. Slowly, she reached into her other pocket and withdrew a simple gold wedding band. The metal caught the firelight, gleaming like a small accusation. "I took it off before I knocked on your door," she whispered. I couldn't bear the thought of you seeing me as his wife." Samuel stared at the ring, understanding flooding through him. "How long were you married?" 3 years. 3 years of walking on eggshells, of measuring every word, of pretending to be happy when people were watching." Elena's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if saying the words aloud was breaking some spell. He was charming at first. Everyone loved Marcus. Successful businessman, pillar of the community, perfect husband material. When did it start? The control came first. Little things. He didn't like my friends, thought they were bad influences. He worried about me driving alone at night. He wanted to manage our money because he was better with numbers. Elena turned the ring over in her palm. Each restriction felt reasonable by itself. It was only when I looked back that I saw the pattern. Samuel felt anger building in his chest again, that same protective fury that had awakened when he'd seen her bruises. And the violence? Elena was quiet for so long that Samuel thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "The first time was when I told him I was pregnant. I was so happy, so excited to share the news. But Marcus, he wasn't ready for children. Said it would interfere with his career plans." She took a shaky breath. "When I said we'd make it work, that people had babies and careers all the time, he slapped me. Just once. Then he cried and apologized and swore it would never happen again. But it did. It got worse after that. He said the pregnancy was making me emotional, difficult, that he was under stress and I needed to be more understanding." Elena closed her fist around the ring. "I started believing him, started thinking it was my fault." Samuel moved closer, his young face serious in the firelight. "It was never your fault. I know that now. But when you're living it, when someone you love is telling you day after day that you're the problem, it becomes hard to trust your own mind." Elena looked directly at Samuel. "The night I left, he said he was going to make sure I never took his child away from him. He said if I tried to leave, he'd kill me and claim I died in childbirth. No one would question a grieving widower." The casual way she spoke of such evil made Samuel's stomach turn. He'd grown up believing that people were fundamentally good, that the mountains were the only real danger in the world. Elena's story shattered that innocent worldview. "That's when you ran. I waited until he was traveling for business, packed what I could carry and left everything else behind." Elena held up the ring one more time, then threw it into the fire. They watched the gold melt and disappear among the coals. "I thought I could make it to my sister in Colorado. I had enough money for a bus ticket and a few nights in a motel. But the storm brought you here," Samuel finished. "Where you're safe." The wooden spoon felt warm in Samuel's hands as he stirred the morning porridge, its surface polished smooth by decades of use. His grandfather had carved it during his first winter on the mountain, whittling away the long, dark hours with nothing but a piece of birch and a sharp knife. The old man's hands had worn grooves into the handle that fit Samuel's fingers perfectly, as if the tool had been waiting for him to grow into it. "Your grandfather made this?" Elena asked, watching him work at the stove. "Everything in this cabin, pretty much. The table, the chairs, most of the shelves." Samuel ladled the thin porridge into 2 bowls, automatically giving Elena the larger portion. He said store-bought things never fit quite right. Better to make what you need with your own hands. Elena accepted her bowl gratefully. The porridge was watery, stretched to feed 2 people, but it was warm and filling. She'd learned not to comment on Samuel's careful rationing. Every meal was a small miracle of planning and sacrifice. "What was he like? Your grandfather?" Samuel's face softened as it always did when speaking of the old man. "Patient, never got angry, even when I made mistakes that cost us food or firewood. He used to say that anger was just fear wearing a disguise, and fear made you stupid when you needed to be smart. Sounds like a wise man, wise enough to survive 40 years up here." Samuel sat cross-legged on the floor near the fire, eating slowly to make the meal last. "He taught me that everything has a purpose, even things that seem useless, like that old coffee can by the door. Most people would throw it away, but grandfather used it to catch drips from the roof leak until he could fix it properly." Elena looked around the cabin with new appreciation, seeing the ingenuity in every corner. Nothing was wasted, nothing overlooked. It was a lesson in survival she'd never encountered in her previous life of abundance. "I could help with the cooking," she offered, "and cleaning. I feel useless just sitting here. You're 8 months pregnant and recovering from nearly freezing to death. Rest is what you need. I need to feel useful." Elena's voice carried an edge of desperation. "I've spent 3 years being told I was helpless, worthless. I can't just sit here being a burden." Samuel studied her face, recognizing something deeper than restlessness. "You're not a burden, but if working makes you feel better, there's plenty to do." They developed a rhythm over the following days. Elena mended Samuel's clothes with needle and thread from his grandfather's sewing kit, her delicate fingers much better suited to the fine work than Samuel's calloused hands. She organized the cabin's modest supplies, creating a more efficient system for their limited resources. In return, Samuel shared stories of mountain life, teaching her to read weather signs and recognize the subtle sounds that meant danger or safety. "See how the smoke from the chimney is rising straight up?" Samuel pointed through the window on their third day together. "That means high pressure, stable weather. When it gets blown sideways or hugs the ground, that's when you worry about storms." Elena followed his gaze, absorbing the lesson. Everything Samuel taught her felt precious, knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death in this harsh environment. But more than that, his patient instruction reminded her of what learning should feel like. No criticism, no impatience, just steady guidance offered with genuine care. "Your grandfather taught you all this, most of it. Some I learned the hard way after he died." Samuel's expression grew distant. "First winter alone, I nearly poisoned myself eating the wrong berries. Grandfather had shown me the difference between safe and dangerous plants, but I got careless when I was desperate. That must have been terrifying, made me more careful, that's for sure." Samuel began preparing their evening meal, another thin soup stretched to satisfy 2 people. "Grandfather used to say that the mountain would teach you everything you needed to know, but some lessons came with a higher price than others." As Elena watched him work, she felt something she'd almost forgotten, the simple pleasure of domestic peace. No walking on eggshells, no measuring words for hidden meanings, no fear of sudden violence. Just 2 people sharing the work of survival, each contributing what they could. "Samuel," she said softly, "when this baby comes, I want you to know that you saved both our lives." He looked up from the stove, his young face serious. "We saved each other. I was dying up here, just slowly. You gave me a reason to live beyond just getting through another day." Elena felt tears threaten but held them back. She'd cried enough in her previous life. This was about gratitude, about recognition of grace received when least expected. Outside, the wind had calmed to a gentle murmur through the pines. The storm that had brought them together was finally breaking, but neither of them spoke about what that might mean. For now, it was enough to share warmth and simple companionship while the world remained frozen around their small sanctuary. The wooden spoons stirred their humble supper, and Elena thought she could feel the love that had been worked into its grain over decades of use. Samuel stared at the empty brown bottle in his hands, turning it over as if somehow more medicine might materialize inside. The label read, "Aspirin, 100 tablets," but the container had been empty for months. His grandfather's modest medical supplies had seemed adequate for one person living alone, but caring for a pregnant woman revealed how woefully unprepared he was for real medical emergencies. Elena sat on the bed, her face pale and drawn. The contractions had returned with a vengeance, stronger and more frequent than before. But it wasn't just the labor pains that worried Samuel. Elena was running a fever, and she'd been bleeding lightly for the past day. "The baby's moving differently," Elena said, her hand pressed to her belly. "Less than before." Samuel knelt beside the bed, wishing desperately for his grandfather's presence. The old man had delivered countless animals over the years, had dealt with complications and emergencies, with steady hands and vast experience. But Samuel had been more interested in hunting and fishing than veterinary medicine. Those lessons seemed irrelevant to his solitary mountain existence. "What does that mean?" Samuel asked, though he feared the answer. "I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe the baby's just running out of room." But Elena's voice carried doubt and growing fear. With my first pregnancy. I mean, this is my first pregnancy. I don't know what's normal. Samuel caught the slip and understood. Elena had been pregnant before, but something had happened. He didn't ask for details, seeing the pain that crossed her face. What do you need? What can I do? Elena tried to smile, but another contraction seized her, stronger than any before. She gripped Samuel's hand with surprising strength, her breathing shallow and rapid. When it passed, she was shaking. The bleeding is getting worse, she whispered. I can feel it. Samuel felt panic rising in his chest. His grandfather had died because they couldn't get him to medical care in time. The old man had suffered a heart attack during a particularly brutal winter, and Samuel had been forced to watch helplessly as the strongest person he'd ever known slipped away. The memory of that helplessness crashed over him now. There has to be something I can do, Samuel said, more to himself than to Elena. Grandfather always found a way. He ransacked the cabin's modest medical supplies. A small bottle of iodine for cuts, some bandages, a needle and thread for stitching wounds. Nothing designed for childbirth complications, nothing that could help with bleeding or fever or the dozen other things that could go wrong. The nearest doctor was in town, 30 miles away through roads that wouldn't be passable for weeks. Even if Samuel could somehow make the journey, Elena would be dead long before he returned with help. They were trapped by geography and weather, facing a medical crisis with nothing but determination and hope. Samuel, Elena's voice was weaker now. I need you to listen to me. If something happens to me, if I don't make it through this, you have to try to save the baby. Don't talk like that. I'm serious. Cut the cord, clear the airway, keep the baby warm. Can you do that? Samuel's mind reeled at the thought. He'd helped his grandfather deliver foals, had seen the miracle of birth in the animal world. But this was different. This was Elena, who'd become precious to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. We're going to get through this together, Samuel said with more confidence than he felt. All three of us. Another contraction hit Elena, and this time she couldn't suppress a cry of pain. Samuel could see blood soaking through the sheets beneath her. Too much blood, far too much for this to be normal. He thought of his grandfather's journal, wondering if there were medical insights he'd missed in his focus on survival techniques. He'd read every page dozens of times, but perhaps there were details about emergency medicine he'd overlooked. Stay here, Samuel said, though Elena was clearly in no condition to go anywhere. I need to check something. He pulled the journal from its shelf and began frantically searching for any mention of childbirth, medical emergencies, anything that might help. His grandfather had been a practical man who'd faced every challenge the mountains could offer. Surely he'd encountered something like this. There, in an entry from 20 years ago, helped Johnson's mare with difficult birth, breech presentation, heavy bleeding. Sometimes nature needs assistance, but gentle hands and patience serve better than panic. It wasn't much, but it was something. Samuel closed the journal and returned to Elena's side, his face set with new determination. My grandfather once helped deliver a foal in trouble, Samuel said. The mare was bleeding, the birth was complicated, but he got them both through it. Elena managed a weak smile. I'm not a horse, Samuel. No, Samuel agreed, but birth is birth. Life wants to happen. Sometimes it just needs help. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the cabin's windows. The storm wasn't finished with them yet, and neither was their test of survival and faith. Samuel pulled his grandfather's snowshoes from the storage space beneath the cabin's floorboards. Their leather bindings cracked from age, but still functional. The wooden frames had carried the old man safely across treacherous terrain for decades, and now they represented Samuel's only hope of reaching help before Elena's condition became fatal. He held them up to the lamplight, checking for weak spots that might give way under stress. The journey to Pete Harrison's place was 15 miles of the most dangerous mountain terrain in the region, made infinitely worse by the blizzard conditions. But Elena was deteriorating rapidly, and Samuel knew he was running out of options. You can't go out there, Elena said from the bed, her voice weak but insistent. Look at that storm. Through the cabin's single window, the world had disappeared into a wall of white. Snow fell so heavily that Samuel couldn't see the woodshed 20 feet away. The wind howled with a ferocity that would make travel not just difficult but suicidal. "Pete Harrison has a radio that reaches the ranger station," Samuel explained, strapping the snowshoes to his boots. "If I can get there, I can call for a helicopter evacuation. In this weather, no helicopter could land." Samuel knew she was right, but desperation was driving him beyond rational thought. Elena's fever had spiked in the last hour, and the bleeding showed no signs of stopping. Every instinct told him to do something, anything, rather than sit helplessly and watch her die. "I have to try," Samuel said, pulling on his grandfather's heaviest coat. "I can't just watch you." "Samuel," Elena's voice cut through his panic. "Come here." He knelt beside the bed, and Elena took his hands in hers. Her skin was burning with fever, but her grip was surprisingly steady. "If you go out there, you'll die, and then I'll die, and the baby will die. All three of us, gone because you tried to be a hero." Her eyes bored into his. "Is that what your grandfather would have done?" Samuel felt the truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. His grandfather had been brave, but never reckless. The old man had survived 4 decades on the mountain by knowing when to act and when to wait, when to fight and when to endure. "Grandfather would have found another way," Samuel admitted. "Then find another way." Samuel sat back on his heels, his mind racing through alternatives. The radio was dead, the roads impassable, the weather too severe for any rescue attempt. But somewhere in his memory, he heard his grandfather's voice. "When you can't go around a problem, sometimes you have to go through it." Another contraction seized Elena, and this time she screamed. The sound tore through Samuel's composure, awakening something primal and protective. When the pain passed, Elena was sobbing. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I'm not strong enough." "Yes, you are." Samuel's voice carried new conviction. "You walked 3 days through a blizzard while 8 months pregnant. You survived 3 years with a man who tried to break your spirit. You're the strongest person I've ever met." Elena looked at him through tears. "What if something goes wrong? What if the baby doesn't make it? What if I don't make it?" Samuel thought of his grandfather's steady hands delivering countless animals, saving lives through skill and determination. He thought of the journal entries that spoke of emergency births, of complications overcome through patience and care. "Then we'll face it together," Samuel said. "But right now, we focus on bringing this baby safely into the world." He removed the snowshoes and hung up his coat, accepting that their fate lay entirely in their own hands. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury. But inside the small cabin, Samuel began preparing for the most important challenge of his young life. He boiled water, gathered clean cloths, sharpened his knife for cutting the umbilical cord. He reviewed everything he could remember from his grandfather's animal deliveries, adapting the knowledge to human birth. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. "Tell me about your sister," Samuel said as he worked, trying to distract Elena from her pain. "The one in Colorado." Elena's face softened slightly. "Maria. She's 5 years older, married to a good man. They have 3 children, all boys. She always said I could come stay with them if I ever needed to escape. After the baby comes, after the road's clear, we'll get you to Maria." "All of us," Elena corrected. "You're part of this family now, whether you like it or not." Samuel felt something warm spread through his chest at the word family. He'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to belong to something larger than himself. Another contraction hit Elena, stronger than before. Samuel took her hand and held it steady, drawing strength from her courage and giving his own in return. Outside, the snowshoes hung unused by the door, a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was stay and fight rather than run toward uncertain help. The storm would pass, eventually, but whatever happened in this cabin tonight would determine whether they faced the future together or alone. Samuel held his grandfather's signal mirror up to the weak afternoon light filtering through the storm clouds, angling it desperately toward the valley, where he hoped someone might see the reflected flash. The mirror was polished steel, designed to catch sunlight and send distress signals across vast distances, but the heavy snowfall made visibility nearly impossible. He stood at the cabin's single window, moving the mirror in the practiced pattern his grandfather had taught him. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short again. SOS in the international Morse code that every mountain dweller understood. But the storm swallowed the light almost immediately, and Samuel knew his efforts were futile. "Anything?" Elena called weakly from the bed. "Too much snow," Samuel admitted, lowering the mirror. "Can't see more than 50 feet in any direction." Elena had been in active labor for 6 hours now, her contractions coming every few minutes with increasing intensity. Samuel had never felt so helpless in his life. All his grandfather's lessons about mountain survival seemed inadequate for this moment when human life hung in the balance. "Samuel," Elena's voice was tight with pain, "I think something's happening." He rushed to her side just as another contraction seized her, but this one was different. Elena's face went white, and she gripped his hand with desperate strength. "The baby's coming now," she gasped. "I can feel it." Samuel's mind went blank with panic. He wasn't ready for this. Elena wasn't ready for this. The cabin, with its primitive conditions, was no place for a birth, especially one with complications. But nature had made the decision for them. "What do I do?" Samuel asked, his voice cracking. "Wash your hands. Get the clean cloths ready." Elena was breathing hard, trying to stay focused through the pain. "And Samuel, don't let me see your fear. I need you to be strong right now." Samuel nodded and moved with purpose, drawing on every lesson his grandfather had ever taught him about emergency situations. "Stay calm, think clearly, do what needs doing without hesitation." He scrubbed his hands with soap and hot water, laid out clean towels, made sure his knife was sterilized for cutting the cord. Elena cried out again, her back arching with the force of the contraction. When it passed, she was breathing in short, sharp pants. "I can see the head," Samuel said, amazement replacing his fear. "Elena, I can see your baby. Is everything okay? Does it look normal?" Samuel had no idea what normal looked like in human birth, but the baby's head appeared perfectly formed, covered in dark hair like Elena's. "Beautiful," he said honestly. "Your baby is beautiful." The next contraction brought the shoulders, and Samuel found himself supporting a tiny, slippery life in his hands. The baby was small but perfectly formed, and for a terrifying moment, completely silent. "Why isn't it crying?" Elena asked frantically. Samuel remembered his grandfather clearing a foal's airway, tilting the newborn to let fluid drain from its lungs. He gently turned the baby, wiping its nose and mouth with a clean cloth. After what felt like an eternity, the infant drew a shuddering breath and let out a strong, healthy wail. "A girl," Samuel said, his voice filled with wonder. "You have a daughter." Elena began crying, relief and joy overwhelming her exhaustion. Samuel carefully placed the baby on Elena's chest, then attended to cutting and tying the umbilical cord with hands that shook only slightly. The baby continued crying, her tiny fists waving in protest at this cold, bright world. "She's perfect," Elena whispered, touching her daughter's face with trembling fingers. "Look at her, Samuel. Look what we did." Samuel felt something profound shift inside his chest as he watched Elena with her newborn daughter. This moment felt sacred in a way he'd never experienced, as if he'd been present at the creation of something miraculous. The storm still raged outside, the cabin was still isolated and primitive, but none of that mattered. Life had triumphed over impossible circumstances. "What will you name her?" Samuel asked. Elena looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears and exhaustion. "Hope," she said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." The baby had stopped crying and was now looking around with dark, alert eyes that seemed to take in her strange new world. Samuel felt an overwhelming surge of protectiveness toward this tiny person who had arrived under such desperate circumstances. "Hello, Hope," Samuel said softly, offering the baby his finger. Her tiny hand closed around it with surprising strength. "Welcome to the world." Elena laughed through her tears. "She likes you already." Samuel realized that in the space of a few hours, his world had completely transformed. He was no longer a solitary mountain boy surviving day to day. He was part of a family now, responsible for protecting these 2 precious lives that had been entrusted to his care. The signal mirror lay forgotten on the windowsill, its polished surface reflecting the warm glow of the fire and the faces of the 3 people who had just become everything to each other. Samuel carefully tore his own flannel shirt into strips, creating a soft swaddle for baby Hope. The fabric had been his favorite, a gift from his grandfather on his 16th birthday, but he didn't hesitate to sacrifice it for the newborn's comfort. The blue and green plaid would make a perfect first blanket for the tiny girl who had changed everything in their small world. "You don't have to use your good shirt," Elena protested weakly, though her voice carried gratitude. "She needs to stay warm," Samuel replied, wrapping Hope with practiced gentleness. "Grandfather always said you take care of what matters most." Elena watched Samuel's careful movements as he tended to her daughter, seeing a maturity that went far beyond his 17 years. The way he held Hope suggested a natural instinct for protection and care that couldn't be taught. It simply existed within him, as much a part of his character as his mountain-bred resilience. "She looks like you," Samuel observed, studying Hope's delicate features. "Same dark hair, same determined chin." "She has her own spirit already," Elena said, marveling at how alert Hope appeared despite being born just hours ago. "Look how she watches everything." Hope's dark eyes moved between Elena and Samuel as if she was already trying to understand her place in this small family. Her tiny fingers gripped the makeshift swaddle with surprising strength, and she made soft sounds that weren't quite crying but seemed like attempts at communication. "Elena," Samuel said quietly, "I've been thinking about names. Her name is Hope." "No, I meant, what should she call me?" Samuel's voice carried uncertainty. "I'm not her father, but I want to be here for her, for both of you." Elena felt tears spring to her eyes at the earnestness in his voice. This boy who had opened his door to a stranger, who had shared his last potato without hesitation, who had delivered her baby with hands steadier than any doctor's. He was asking for permission to love them both. "What would you like her to call you?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his finger tracing circles on Hope's tiny palm. "My grandfather used to tell stories about his brother, a man named Samuel who died in the war. He said that sometimes families aren't made by blood, but by choice, by people who decide to love each other no matter what." "Samuel," Elena said softly, understanding what he was trying to say. "I know it sounds crazy. I'm 17 years old. I live in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. I have nothing to offer except I love you both already. More than I thought possible." Samuel's voice cracked slightly. "I want to be Hope's big brother, if you'll let me. I want to be your family." Elena reached out and took Samuel's hand, pulling him closer to the bed where she and Hope lay. "You already are our family. You have been since the moment you opened that door." Samuel felt something inside his chest break open, releasing emotions he'd kept carefully contained since his grandfather's death. He'd been so focused on survival that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have people to live for, rather than just existing from one day to the next. "I want to give her something," Samuel said suddenly. "A middle name, if that's okay." "What did you have in mind?" "Hope Eleanor Mitchell Rodriguez. Eleanor was my grandmother's name. Grandfather always said she was the strongest woman he ever knew, that she could have survived anything these mountains threw at her." Elena's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Hope Eleanor Mitchell Rodriguez," she repeated. "It's perfect." As if responding to her new full name, Hope made a small sound that might have been approval. Samuel laughed. The first truly joyful sound he'd made in 2 years. "She likes it," he said. "I think she's going to fit right in up here." "About that," Elena said carefully, "Samuel, when spring comes, when the road's clear, I still need to get to my sister in Colorado. For Hope's sake, she needs proper medical care, schooling, a normal life." Samuel's face fell slightly, but he nodded. "I understand. You both deserve better than this place. I want you to come with us." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and hope. Samuel stared at Elena, not quite believing what he'd heard. "You mean it? Maria has plenty of room, and she'd love to meet the man who saved our lives. Hope is going to need her big brother, and I'm going to need my family." Elena's voice was firm with conviction. "All of us together, or not at all." Samuel looked down at Hope, who had fallen asleep in her makeshift swaddle of his shirt. The baby's face was peaceful, trusting, completely secure in the knowledge that she was loved and protected. For the first time since his grandfather's death, Samuel allowed himself to imagine a future that held more than just survival. "The Mitchell-Rodriguez family," he said softly, testing how the words sounded. "The Mitchell-Rodriguez family," Elena agreed, and hope stirred slightly in her sleep, as if she too approved of their new beginning. Samuel stared at the last can of formula on the shelf, its cheerful label mocking their desperate situation. He'd found it buried in the back of his grandfather's emergency supplies, probably left over from when Samuel himself was a baby. The expiration date had long passed, but it represented Hope's only chance at proper nutrition now that Elena's milk wasn't coming in as it should. "How much is left?" Elena asked from the bed, where she was trying unsuccessfully to nurse Hope. The baby fussed and cried, clearly hungry but unable to get enough nourishment. "Maybe 3 days' worth if I stretch it thin." Samuel kept his voice steady, not wanting Elena to hear his growing panic. Hope was only 5 days old, and already their inadequate supplies were failing them. Elena's recovery had been slower than expected. The primitive conditions, stress, and inadequate nutrition were taking their toll. She was weak, running periodic fevers, and her body wasn't producing enough milk to sustain Hope. Samuel found himself facing the cruel irony that he'd successfully delivered the baby only to watch her slowly starve. "She needs more than I can give her," Elena said, her voice breaking. "Look at her, Samuel. She's so small." Hope did seem smaller than when she was born, her tiny face pinched with hunger. She cried weakly, lacking the energy for the strong wails that had first announced her arrival. Samuel felt his heart breaking as he watched the baby struggle. "I have to go down to the valley," Samuel said, though the words felt like accepting defeat. "There's a trading post about 12 miles south. They might have supplies." "In this weather, Samuel, the snow is still falling. Not as hard as before. I can make it on snowshoes if I start early and travel light." Samuel was already planning the treacherous journey in his head. "I'll take the emergency pack, move fast, get back before dark." Elena knew he was right, but the thought of being alone with Hope while Samuel risked his life filled her with terror. What if something happened to him? What if he got lost in the storm, or fell through ice, or simply disappeared into the white wilderness that had already claimed so many lives? "Promise me you'll be careful," Elena said. "Promise me you'll come back to us." "I promise." Samuel knelt beside the bed and kissed Hope's tiny forehead. The baby was so light in his arms, so fragile. "I'll bring back everything she needs." Samuel prepared for the journey with meticulous care, packing only essentials in his grandfather's emergency backpack: water, emergency food, rope, compass, matches in a waterproof container. He strapped on the snowshoes and checked his grandfather's hunting knife, hoping he wouldn't need it but grateful for its reassuring weight. "If I'm not back by sunset, light the oil lamp in the window," Samuel instructed. "I'll use it to navigate home." "Don't even think about not coming back," Elena replied fiercely. "We need you." The journey began well enough. Samuel made good time across the familiar terrain, following ridgelines and avoiding areas where avalanches might threaten. The snow had lessened to intermittent flurries, and visibility was better than it had been in days. But as he descended toward the valley, the conditions worsened. What should have been a 6-hour round trip stretched into an agonizing endurance test. Samuel broke through ice twice, soaking his feet in freezing water that would have been fatal without his grandfather's waterproof boots. He had to detour around fallen trees and navigate by compass when landmarks disappeared in swirling snow. The trading post was closed when he finally reached it, the elderly proprietor surprised to see anyone traveling in such conditions. But Samuel's desperation was evident, and the man opened his store, selling Samuel canned formula, baby bottles, and basic medical supplies at fair prices, despite the emergency circumstances. "You're taking a hell of a risk for supplies," the man observed as Samuel loaded his pack. "It's for my baby sister," Samuel replied without thinking, then realized how naturally the words had come. Hope truly was his sister now, in every way that mattered. The return journey was a nightmare of exhaustion and growing cold. Samuel's body was failing him after months of inadequate nutrition, and the weight of the supplies made every step an effort. Darkness fell before he reached the cabin, and he navigated the last 2 miles by the faint glow of Elena's lamp in the window. When he finally stumbled through the door, more dead than alive, Elena cried with relief. Samuel's hands were so cold he couldn't feel his fingers, and his lips were blue with hypothermia. The formula, Samuel managed through chattering teeth, got everything Hope needs. Elena helped him out of his frozen clothes and wrapped him in blankets by the fire. While he warmed up, she prepared Hope's first bottle of proper formula. The baby latched onto it eagerly, drinking with the desperate hunger of someone who had been slowly starving. "She's going to be okay," Elena said, watching Hope drink. "You saved her life." Samuel watched his baby sister feed, feeling warmth return to his body and soul. The can of formula that had represented their deadline now seemed like abundance. They would find a way to make it last until spring brought rescue and new possibilities. Hope finished her bottle and fell asleep in Elena's arms, finally peaceful and satisfied. The immediate crisis had passed, but Samuel knew it was only the first of many challenges they would face together. Elena was changing Hope's diaper when she noticed the small black device sewn into the lining of her coat pocket. No bigger than a button, it had been carefully concealed beneath the fabric, where she would never think to look. Her blood turned to ice as understanding crashed over her. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Samuel, come here, now." Samuel looked up from the fire where he was warming Hope's bottle, immediately alert to the terror in Elena's voice. She held up the tiny device with shaking fingers, and he saw his own horror reflected in her eyes. "GPS tracker," Elena said, the words coming out like a prayer of desperation. "He's been tracking me this whole time." The implications hit Samuel like a physical blow. Marcus knew exactly where they were, had probably known since the first night Elena arrived. The mountain isolation that had felt like protection was actually a trap, leaving them with nowhere to run. "How long has it been there?" "I don't know. Could be months. He was always so paranoid about me leaving, but I never thought." Elena's voice broke as the full scope of Marcus's control became clear. "He's been watching me, planning." As if summoned by their fear, the sound of snowmobile engines cut through the mountain silence. Multiple machines, moving fast up the treacherous mountain trail that should have been impassable. Samuel rushed to the window and saw lights bobbing through the trees, growing steadily brighter. 3 snowmobiles, Samuel reported, his mind already calculating their options. Maybe 4 or 5 men. Elena clutched Hope protectively to her chest, the baby sensing her mother's distress and beginning to fuss. "He found us. Oh God, Samuel, he found us. How many people does Marcus have working for him?" "Enough. He has money, connections, men who don't ask questions if the price is right." Elena's voice carried the flat despair of someone whose worst nightmare was becoming reality. "He told me once that if I ever tried to leave him, he'd hunt me to the ends of the earth." The snowmobile engines grew louder, accompanied now by the sound of boots crunching through snow. Samuel grabbed his grandfather's hunting rifle from above the fireplace, checking to make sure it was loaded. 2 shots. That's all he had against superior numbers and whatever weapons Marcus had brought. "Elena, take Hope and get in the back corner behind the bed. Stay low." "Samuel, you can't fight them. There are too many." "I won't let him take you." Samuel's voice carried absolute conviction. "I won't let him hurt Hope." A harsh voice cut through the night air, amplified by a megaphone. "Elena, I know you're in there. Come out now, and maybe I won't kill the boy who's been harboring my wife." Marcus's voice was exactly what Samuel had expected. Cold, controlled, radiating the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of getting his way through intimidation and violence. It was the voice of a man who had never been told no and didn't intend to start now. "You have 30 seconds, Elena. Then we come in shooting." Elena looked at Samuel with anguished eyes. "I have to go to him. If I don't, he'll kill you and take Hope anyway." "No." Samuel moved to block the door. "We face this together, or not at all." "Samuel, you don't understand what he's capable of. And he doesn't understand what I'm capable of." Samuel checked the rifle's sight. "This is my mountain, Elena. I know every rock, every tree, every place a man can hide or get trapped. Marcus may have numbers, but I have advantage. Hope began crying in earnest now, her infant instincts picking up on the tension and fear surrounding her. Elena rocked her gently, trying to comfort the baby while her own world collapsed around her. "Time's up, Elena." Marcus's voice was closer now, just outside the cabin. "Last chance to do this the easy way." Samuel moved to the window and saw them clearly for the first time. 4 men in winter gear, armed with rifles and handguns. Marcus stood in the center, a tall man with sharp features and cold eyes that reflected no warmth even in the firelight from the cabin. "Marcus Rodriguez," Samuel called out, "you must be the mountain boy. Foolish child, thinking you could hide my wife from me." "She's not your wife anymore," Samuel replied, his young voice carrying surprising authority. "She's my family now, and you're trespassing on my land." Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Your land? Boy, I'm about to show you what real ownership looks like." Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his grandfather's hunting rifle, the familiar weight both comforting and terrifying. The weapon had taken countless deer over the years, had put food on their table through 40 harsh winters, but Samuel had never pointed it at another human being. The moral weight of that moment pressed down on his 17-year-old shoulders like a mountain itself. "Put the gun down, boy," Marcus called through the cabin door. "You're outgunned and outmanned. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The only thing that needs to happen is you leaving my property," Samuel replied, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. Elena crouched behind the bed with Hope, watching Samuel take position by the window. The baby had gone quiet, as if sensing that silence might mean survival. Elena felt her heart breaking as she watched this boy prepare to fight a battle that should never have been his. "Samuel," she whispered urgently, "he's not going to negotiate. Marcus doesn't compromise. He takes what he wants. Then he's about to learn that some things can't be taken." Marcus's patience was clearly running thin. "Elena, I'm going to count to 3. If you don't come out, I'll burn this place down with all of you inside. 1. Samuel's finger found the trigger, his grandfather's lessons flooding back to him. "Breathe steady. Pick your target. Don't hesitate when the moment comes." 2. "Elena, I love you," Samuel said quietly. "Both of you. Whatever happens, remember that." Elena felt tears streaming down her face. This brave, stubborn boy was willing to die for them, and she couldn't bear the thought of his blood on her hands. But before she could respond, Marcus's voice cut through the night. 3. Light it up." The first shots shattered the cabin's single window, sending glass flying across the room. Samuel ducked, then returned fire through the broken frame. His first shot caught one of Marcus's men in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him stumbling into the snow. "The boy's got teeth," Marcus shouted. "Spread out, surround the cabin." Samuel's second shot went wide as he was forced to duck incoming fire. The hunting rifle held only 2 shells, and now he was down to whatever ammunition his grandfather had stored elsewhere in the cabin. Not much against 4 determined men with modern weapons. "Elena," Marcus called out during a lull in the shooting, "I know you can hear me. Look around you, darling. This is what happens when you run from me. This boy is going to die because of your selfishness." "Don't listen to him," Samuel whispered as he reloaded. "This isn't your fault." But Elena was already rising to her feet, Hope clutched protectively in her arms. "Marcus, stop shooting. I'll come out." "No," Samuel said firmly. "Elena, don't. I won't let you die for me." Elena's voice carried a mother's fierce determination. "I won't let Hope grow up knowing that people died because of her." Marcus's laughter carried clearly through the broken window. "Smart girl, I always knew you'd see reason eventually." "I have conditions," Elena called back. "You're not in a position to make conditions, darling. The boy and the baby stay here, unharmed. You get me, that's all." Samuel felt his world tilting on its axis. "Elena, no, we're a family. We face this together. Some sacrifices are worth making," Elena replied, echoing words Samuel's grandfather had once spoken about different kinds of courage. Marcus seemed to consider her offer. "The baby comes with us. She's my daughter too." "The baby stays." Elena's voice carried steel. "She's safer here with Samuel than she'll ever be with you." "Wrong answer, Elena. The baby is mine by law, and I'm taking what belongs to me." That's when Samuel understood with crystal clarity what Marcus really was. Not just an abusive husband, but a man who viewed other human beings as possessions to be owned and controlled. Hope wasn't his daughter in his mind. She was his property. "Nobody owns anybody," Samuel said, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Not Elena, not Hope, not anybody." "Pretty words from a dead man," Marcus replied. "I'm done talking. Boys, burn them out." Samuel saw the flicker of torches being lit outside, and his blood turned to ice. Marcus wasn't just trying to reclaim his wife. He was willing to kill them all rather than accept defiance. The hunting rifle suddenly felt inadequate against such casual evil. "Elena," Samuel said urgently, "there's a root cellar under the cabin. Take Hope and hide there." "What about you?" Samuel looked at the rifle in his hands, then at the family he'd sworn to protect. "I'm going to buy you time to escape." Samuel's fingers found the hidden latch beneath the loose floorboard near the stone hearth, just as his grandfather had shown him years ago. The board lifted to reveal a narrow opening that led to a natural cave system his grandfather had discovered when building the cabin. It was their emergency shelter, carved by underground springs and expanded by hand to create a hidden refuge that could sustain someone for weeks if necessary. "Down here," Samuel whispered urgently to Elena, "there's food and water stored below, enough for several days." Elena peered into the dark opening, holding Hope close to her chest. The baby had remained remarkably quiet, as if she understood that silence meant survival. "What about you?" "I'm going to lead them away from here, give you time to escape through the back entrance." Samuel was already moving, gathering supplies by feel in the darkness. "There's a tunnel that comes out near the stream, about a quarter-mile from here." "Samuel, you can't face 4 armed men alone." "I'm not going to face them. I'm going to use the mountain against them." Samuel's voice carried a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "These men don't know this terrain. They're following snowmobile trails and obvious paths. I know every cave, every cliff, every place where the snow gets unstable." Elena could hear Marcus and his men moving around the cabin, testing windows and doors, looking for the best way to force entry without exposing themselves to Samuel's rifle. Soon, they would lose patience and simply torch the building. "Take this." Samuel pressed something into Elena's hands. It was his grandfather's emergency flare, bright red and designed to signal rescue aircraft from miles away. "If you get to safety and I don't make it back, use this to call for help." "Don't talk like that. Elena, listen to me." Samuel gripped her shoulders gently. "If something happens to me, you take Hope and you go to your sister in Colorado. You give her a normal life, with schools and friends and everything I can't provide up here." Elena felt tears freezing on her cheeks. "You're part of this family, Samuel. Hope needs her big brother, and I need my little sister to be safe." Samuel kissed Hope's forehead one last time. "Tell her stories about the mountain boy who loved her. Okay?" Before Elena could protest further, Samuel helped her down into the hidden cave. The space was larger than it appeared from above, with shelves carved into the rock walls holding canned goods, water containers, and basic supplies. His grandfather had planned for every emergency except the one they now faced. "Follow the tunnel to the back entrance," Samuel instructed. "It's marked with a white stone. From there, head downhill toward the valley. Don't look back, no matter what you hear." Elena wanted to argue, to find some other solution that didn't require Samuel to sacrifice himself for their safety, but hope stirred in her arms and maternal instinct overrode everything else. Her daughter's survival had to come first. "I love you, Samuel Mitchell," Elena said fiercely. "You're the best man I've ever known." Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I love you too. Both of you. Now go." He lowered the floorboard back into place and scattered the rug to hide any trace of the entrance. Through the broken window, he could see torches moving closer to the cabin. Marcus was done with negotiation and patience. Samuel gathered what he could carry: extra ammunition for the rifle, his grandfather's hunting knife, a coil of rope, and matches. He also took the small hatchet from beside the fireplace. If he was going to make a stand, he would use every advantage the mountain could provide. "Time's up," Marcus shouted from outside. "I'm coming in whether you're ready or not." Samuel moved to the back window. the one that faced the dense forest behind the cabin. It was smaller than the front window, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, but it would have to do. As he prepared to climb out, Samuel caught sight of his grandfather's photograph on the mantelpiece. The old man's weathered face seemed to be watching him, and Samuel could almost hear his voice. Sometimes the mountain asks more of you than you think you can give. That's when you find out what you're really made of. The first torch hit the cabin's front wall, and Samuel smelled smoke beginning to build. Marcus wasn't bluffing about burning them out. But he would find the cabin empty, and by the time he realized his quarry had escaped, Samuel would be leading him on a chase through terrain that favored the hunted over the hunter. Samuel squeezed through the back window into the freezing night air. Behind him, the cabin that had been his home for 17 years began to burn. Ahead lay the dark forest and a desperate gamble that his knowledge of these mountains would be enough to save the family he'd chosen to protect. The emergency flare lay hidden in Elena's hands, their last hope for rescue if Samuel's plan failed. But as he disappeared into the trees, Samuel was already thinking 3 moves ahead, just as his grandfather had taught him. The mountain would test him tonight, but he intended to pass that test. Samuel's hands trembled as he pulled the emergency flare from his pack, the bright red cylinder feeling both heavy and weightless in his freezing fingers. His grandfather had carried this flare for 20 years, saving it for the one moment when rescue might mean the difference between life and death. That moment had finally come, but not in any way the old man could have imagined. He'd led Marcus and his men on a grueling chase through the darkest, most treacherous parts of the mountain for over an hour. 2 of them had already fallen behind, one with a twisted ankle from stepping in a hidden crevice, another nursing frostbite after Samuel had led them through waist-deep snow. But Marcus and one remaining man pressed on with the determination of predators who'd caught the scent of prey. Samuel crouched behind a fallen pine tree, listening to their voices carry through the thin mountain air. They were close now, maybe 50 yards below his position on the rocky outcrop that his grandfather had always called Eagle's Perch. It was here that the old man had taught Samuel to read the weather, to spot game moving through distant valleys, to understand the mountain's moods and rhythms. "I know you're up there, boy," Marcus called out, his voice hoarse from exertion and cold. "You can't run forever. These mountains will kill you before dawn if the cold doesn't get you first." Samuel knew Marcus was right. The temperature was dropping fast, and he'd been moving hard for too long on too little food. His body was beginning to fail him, his hands shaking, not just with cold, but with exhaustion. If this chase continued much longer, he'd collapse whether Marcus caught him or not. But Elena and Hope should be safe by now. If they'd followed the tunnel system as he'd instructed, they would have emerged near the stream and could follow it downhill toward the valley. By morning, they might reach the main road where someone could help them. "Your girlfriend and her bastard baby are going to freeze to death out there," Marcus continued, his words calculated to provoke. "Is that what you want? To be responsible for killing an innocent child?" Samuel felt rage flash through him at the casual cruelty in Marcus's voice. This man didn't see Hope as his daughter or even as a human being. She was just leverage to be used, a tool to manipulate and control. The realization strengthened Samuel's resolve. He pulled the pin from the emergency flare and held it ready. The device would burn for 15 minutes, visible for miles in the clear mountain air. But it would also reveal his exact position to Marcus and his remaining gunmen. It was a desperate gamble, signal for help while making himself a target. "Let me tell you something about that baby," Samuel called back, his young voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Her name is Hope Eleanor Mitchell Rodriguez. She's my sister, and she's going to grow up free of your poison." "Mitchell Rodriguez?" Marcus's laugh was ugly. "You think you can steal my family name, boy? You think you can replace me? I already have." Samuel ignited the flare and held it high above his head. Brilliant red light exploded across the mountainside, turning the snow into a field of crimson and casting dancing shadows among the trees. The flare hissed and sparked, sending up a column of smoke that would be visible from the valley below. The response was immediate. Samuel heard Marcus curse and saw muzzle flashes as both men opened fire on his position. He dropped behind the fallen tree, the flare still burning in his hand like a beacon of hope and defiance. "There!" Marcus shouted to his companion. "Pin him down! Don't let him move!" Samuel knew he had perhaps 10 minutes before the flare burned out. 10 minutes for someone in the valley to see the signal and call for help. 10 minutes to stay alive while 2 armed men tried to kill him. He clutched his grandfather's hunting rifle, knowing he had only a few shots left. But as bullets chipped bark from the tree above his head, Samuel felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. He'd done what he set out to do. Elena and Hope were safe, heading toward a new life far from Marcus's reach. Even if he didn't survive this night, he'd kept his promise to protect his family. The flare continued to burn, its light reflecting off the snow and ice like a prayer made visible. Somewhere down in the valley, Samuel hoped someone was looking up at the mountain and wondering why a distress signal was burning in the wilderness. Someone who would call the authorities, send help, maybe even find Elena and Hope before the cold claimed them. "You're done, boy," Marcus called out, his voice closer now. "Drop the gun, and maybe I'll make this quick." Samuel took careful aim through a gap in the fallen tree's branches. When Marcus showed himself, Samuel would have one clear shot. After that, it would be up to fate, the mountain, and the emergency flare that burned like a star in his freezing hand. The mountain had tested him all his life, but never like this. Tonight would determine whether Samuel Mitchell was truly his grandfather's worthy heir. Elena emerged from the tunnel entrance near the stream, Hope clutched tightly against her chest, when she heard the gunshots echoing across the mountain. The sound cut through her like a blade, and she knew Samuel was in mortal danger. She pulled out the small camera from her coat pocket, the one she'd used to take secret pictures of her bruises as evidence she'd never been brave enough to use, and quickly snapped a photo of herself with Hope and the mountain backdrop. If they didn't survive this night, at least there would be proof that Hope Mitchell Rodriguez had existed, had been loved. "I'm sorry, baby," Elena whispered to Hope as she turned back toward the sound of gunfire. "I can't leave him to face this alone." Samuel's rifle cracked once more from the rocky outcrop above, followed immediately by Marcus's roar of rage. Elena could see the emergency flare burning like a fallen star against the mountainside, casting everything in hellish red light. She began climbing back up the slope, following Samuel's trail through the snow. Marcus appeared at the edge of the clearing below Samuel's position, his expensive winter gear torn and bloodied from the chase through hostile terrain. His remaining gunmen flanked to the right, trying to get a clear shot at Samuel's hiding place. But Elena could see what they couldn't. Samuel was trapped, pinned down with nowhere to retreat. "Samuel!" Elena called out, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "I'm here!" All 3 men turned toward her voice in shock. Marcus's face twisted with fury at seeing his wife had escaped the burning cabin. "Elena, no!" Samuel shouted. "Get Hope away from here." But Elena was already moving, driven by a mother's protective fury and something deeper, the realization that this family was worth fighting for. She'd spent 3 years being a victim, letting Marcus control her through fear and manipulation. Not anymore. "Marcus!" Elena called out, stepping into the open where all 3 men could see her. "You want me? Come and take me." Marcus started toward her, his gun trained on Samuel's position. "Clever girl, but you're both going to die for making me chase you up this god-forsaken mountain." "No," Elena said, her voice carrying a strength she'd never known she possessed. "You are." That's when the mountain itself seemed to join their fight. Samuel's grandfather had always said the peaks had their own justice, their own way of settling accounts. A deep rumble echoed through the valley, followed by the distinctive crack of shifting snow high above their position. "Avalanche!" Samuel screamed. The emergency flare had done more than signal for help. Its heat had destabilized an already precarious snow shelf, 500 feet above them. Thousands of tons of snow and ice began moving down the mountainside with unstoppable force. Marcus looked up just in time to see death approaching in a wall of white. His remaining gunmen turned to run, but there was nowhere to go. The avalanche would scour the entire valley clean. Samuel leaped from his hiding place and sprinted toward Elena, driven by desperate love and the slim hope that they might find shelter together. Elena ran to meet him, Hope still secure in her arms, her feet finding purchase on terrain that should have been impossible to navigate. They reached each other just as the avalanche hit Marcus and his gunmen, swallowing them in a roar that shook the entire mountain. Samuel grabbed Elena's hand and pulled her toward a small cave opening he'd spotted in the rock face, a natural shelter that might protect them from the avalanche's fury. They dove into the shallow cave just as the snow wall swept past, filling the air with ice crystals and the sound of the mountain reshaping itself. For long minutes they huddled together in the darkness, holding hope between them while the world outside was transformed. When silence finally returned, they emerged to find the landscape completely changed. Where Marcus and his men had stood, there was now only pristine snow stretching down into the valley. The mountain had delivered its own verdict. "Is he?" Elena couldn't finish the question. "Gone," Samuel said quietly. "They're all gone." Elena looked down at Hope, who had somehow slept through the entire ordeal, and then at the photograph still clutched in her other hand. In the image, despite everything they'd endured, all three of them were smiling. They looked like what they'd become, a family. "We did it," Elena whispered. "We're free." Samuel wrapped his arms around both of them, feeling the truth of those words settle into his bones. They were free. Free to build the life they'd dreamed of, free to raise Hope in safety and love, free to be the family they'd chosen to become. The emergency flare continued to burn on the mountainside above them, no longer a desperate signal for rescue but a beacon of hope, visible for miles around. Help would come eventually, drawn by that red light in the darkness. But they didn't need rescue anymore. They had each other, and that was enough to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The hand-carved wooden sign hung proudly beside the front door of their new home, its fresh pine scent mingling with the mountain air. Samuel had spent weeks crafting it in his grandfather's old workshop, carefully burning the letters deep into the wood, the Mitchell Rodriguez family home. Below that, in smaller script, Elena, Samuel, and Hope. Est. Winter 2024. Spring had come to the mountain with unusual gentleness, melting the snow gradually and revealing the world reborn beneath. The cabin that had burned in Marcus's attack was being rebuilt, but this time it would be larger, with proper rooms for each family member and modern conveniences that would make mountain living sustainable for a growing child. Elena stood on the front porch, watching Samuel teach 18-month-old Hope how to stack smooth river stones. The little girl had her mother's determination and her adopted brother's patience, carefully placing each stone with the concentration of someone who understood that building required both vision and care. "Higher, Hope," Samuel encouraged, steadying the tower when it threatened to wobble. "Grandfather always said the best foundations start with stones that fit together naturally." Hope babbled something that might have been agreement and reached for another stone. She'd taken her first steps on this same porch 6 months ago, walking from Elena's arms into Samuel's waiting embrace. Her first word hadn't been Mama or Dada, but Sam, which had made her big brother cry with joy. The local authorities had closed Marcus's case months ago. The avalanche had been ruled a natural disaster, and there were no surviving witnesses to suggest otherwise. Elena's legal troubles had vanished, along with her abusive husband, leaving her free to start over without the shadow of his threats hanging over their future. Samuel was now 18, legally old enough to be Hope's guardian alongside Elena. The adoption papers had been finalized the previous month, making their chosen family official in the eyes of the law. Samuel Mitchell Rodriguez had a nice ring to it, Elena thought, watching him patiently help Hope with her stone tower. "The social worker called this morning," Elena said, joining them on the porch. "Hope's medical records show she's developing perfectly, strong, healthy, hitting every milestone." "Of course she is," Samuel replied, catching Hope as she lunged for a stone just out of reach. "She's a mountain girl. We're built tough up here." Elena smiled at how naturally Samuel had taken to fatherhood, despite his youth. He read to Hope every night from the same adventure stories his grandfather had shared with him. He taught her to identify bird calls and weather patterns. He made sure she knew that she was loved unconditionally, something Elena had never experienced in her own childhood. Maria, Elena's sister, visited frequently from Colorado, bringing her 3 boys to play with their newest cousin. The children adored Samuel, who seemed to have an endless capacity for patience and storytelling. Maria often joked that Elena had found herself the perfect husband, even if he was technically her adopted son. As evening approached, Samuel carried Hope inside for her bath, while Elena lingered on the porch, looking up at the mountain peaks that had once seemed so forbidding. Now they felt like protectors, ancient guardians watching over their small family. The wooden sign creaked gently in the mountain breeze, its carved letters catching the last rays of sunlight. Elena traced the words with her finger, marveling at how far they'd all come from that desperate night when she'd knocked on a stranger's door. Inside, she could hear Samuel's voice reading Hope her bedtime story, the same tale his grandfather had told him about brave children who found families in unexpected places. Hope's sleepy giggles drifted through the window, the sound of pure contentment. Elena pulled her shawl closer against the evening chill and went inside to join her family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, new opportunities to prove that love really could conquer the harshest circumstances. But tonight, there was only warmth and safety, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing they were exactly where they belonged.